So our theme for this one is really the theme of the whole weekend, which is being ambassadors for Christ and what that actually looks like. And the section from 2 Corinthians is the phrase particularly we want to hone in on to is that God makes his appeal through us. We are the avenue by which God is making his appeal to the rest of the world. And we're going to just quickly look at what that means to us in our life right now. Now, an ambassador, and I'm sure you've looked at this, we've looked at it all weekend, is a representative, isn't he? If you're an ambassador of a country, the ambassador of Australia to America was, I'm not sure who it was now, but it was recently Joe Hockey. And he was in charge of representing everything Australia was to America. Whether he did a good job of that, I'm not sure. But that's what the role of the ambassador is. He's got to represent every sort of cultural aspect and the traditions and all of the key principles of our country to that nation. And that's what we're called to. We're called to be ambassadors, not to a country, well, not to a country here anyway, but a future country, a future city, a place that we're all looking for. And our ambassadorship is to the Lord Jesus Christ, and we are called to be faithful representations of him. Now, Jesus knew how important this was because for the vast majority of his ministry of 3 years, he spent it trying to instill this into his disciples, because he knew once the short time had gone that he would be on the world, it would be left to them, and they would be his voice and his hands and his feet to the world. And so he spends his time developing in them the traits that they needed to be ambassadors for Christ. And so that's what they did. And then, of course, from those first 12 disciples, the ambassadorship was passed to Paul, who became Christ to the Gentiles, a living representation in a remarkable way in that man's life of everything that Jesus Christ was. And there's been this continual passing of the baton from that day forward, from the time of Paul to the next person, and then continually this baton has been passed on to each generation to take hold of that ambassadorship and to be that Christ and to be that message to each generation. And the important part about that actually is that changing of the baton. Now, I was looking a little bit at some YouTube videos yesterday on changing the baton and some really bad examples of it. And like all sort of movements into YouTube, it was about 3 hours later that I surfaced out of it. But I just want to show you one that I found particularly good to just illustrate my point. So I'm going to share my screen here. And this is an example of a really bad baton passing. This is from like a world championship, maybe sort of like 10 years ago. And it's the 4x100 meter relay race. Just absolutely pathetic. And I'm going to go back again and show you that in slow motion, just so you can see how bad that actually was, right? Now, what's interesting, I think, about that is that so bad a baton change was that there ended up being like almost a fight between them, sort of mid-baton pass. And then obviously when they're just on the ground, so disappointed about it. It was just a disastrous episode in this passing of the baton. Now, apparently when you pass the baton, it seems like a pretty simple thing, doesn't it? But there's apparently a great science to it, and one that they go through very, very carefully to get it right, because you think these guys, they train their entire life, and it comes down to this one moment. If they get it wrong, it's just completely ruins the entire race. And it's the responsibility of both of those people in that race to pass the baton correctly. It's the responsibility of the first person who's got the baton to actually, he's the one they call the one that sights the hand. He has to look for the hand, and he has to place the baton into the hand very, very carefully. And then the person who's receiving the baton is the receiver. And all their job is, but it's an important job, is to have their hand out ready to take it. And if they don't have their hand out ready to take it, it turns into a disaster like just happened then. And both of those people, and you can see the disappointment in their faces at the conclusion of the race, ended up not doing their role. And passing of the baton is what Paul is trying to do in passing the message to the next people, and what we've each individually got to do in our own lives. Now, that passing of the baton is important, and you might be in the position, and most of us here are pretty young, right? And that's not me, because I class young probably as 40 down, and I'm now 41. So I've gone into the dark period of oldness. But you're either in the position of passing the baton down or collecting the baton. And many of you will be in the position of taking that baton. And it's such an important thing to do. And often there can be a lot of blame on the person who's passing you the baton, that they didn't pass it to me correctly or in the correct way or the way I would have liked it. But the point is that both parties are responsible for the smooth transition of that baton to the next generation. And Paul, who was the ambassador to Jesus Christ, wanted to make sure when he passed the baton that he passed it correctly, and that he chose the right person to take on the message of Jesus Christ. Now, he was in his late 60s, mid to late 60s, and he's in prison. And he's staring down the prospect of dying in the Colosseum, eaten by lions. And he was trying to select the perfect person that could be the ambassador to take on the message of Jesus Christ to the next generation. And so he penned his final letter in that prison. And does anyone know what the final letter that Paul wrote was? And if people from Queensland don't get this, Scott Madden is going to be so disappointed in you.
2 Timothy.
Yes, awesome. Well done. 2 Timothy. So he penned his letter in 2 Timothy. And of course, the man that he chose to be his ambassador, the one that would take on the message from that point on, was this man, Timothy. Now, when you think about who you would choose for such an important job, you perhaps try and think of like the guy that was, perhaps the most prominent, perhaps the loudest guy, the most connected person, perhaps had a lot of influence in high-powered positions. That's what corporate world would look for, wouldn't it? If they were going to pass the ambassadorship of their company to the next generation. But Paul was very specific in choosing the type of ambassador that he needed for Christ. And he chose this man, Timothy. And I think he becomes then this beautiful representation of what it means to be an ambassador of Christ. Timothy was young. He was actually of a diverse background. He had a Greek mother and a Greek father and a Jewish mother. He was naturally not an extroverted person who was out there in front of people. He was timid and he was shy in his personality. He was also not of great health. He was someone who struggled with his health at various times of his life. And it was this man that Paul chose who had the traits that he needed to be the ambassador for Christ. And I just want to look at 5 or 6 characteristics that Paul picks out in 2 Timothy about this man that he wants in all of us to be ambassadors for Christ. Some really powerful things. So the first thing is he chose Timothy as a young person, right? At this point, Timothy is probably in his early 30s, right? Probably the prime of his life. I look back and think probably your late 30s. Your early 30s was the prime of your life. And he chose that point to appoint Timothy. And the reason why he did that was because it's so important that the message keeps getting passed down to the youth. And the reason why that's important is because it's the young people that can relate to the next generation down, because they understand the challenges and the world in which the next generation is growing up. And that's all of you guys. You are in that position. And the powerful thing that you have, that I don't have now as I've transferred to my 40s, is the ability to relate sometimes to the new world and new generation and take God's message and apply that to that next generation. And Paul saw an incredible need for that. I try and keep up through my kids. I've got 4 kids. Probably some of them will burst in here during this session. And I try and keep up with what's going on, the latest sort of technology and that. But it just, I'm falling short every day. I still think that Fortnite is a period of time. And I still think that TikTok is a type of biscuit, which I enjoy from time to time. I don't, and I can't keep up. And that's the point. We can't keep up. And it's not that you've got to have an unbelievable understanding of the current generation of all of the technologies. Of course, that's not the case. But you're able to repackage and share with the new generation the power of God's message. And Paul knew that that was important. And so this message needed to go to Timothy, and then it needed to go to the next person and continue to go down that generation. And that baton is now being passed to you guys who are in your teens or your 20s or your 30s. And you need to be able to take that, like Timothy did, and take that influence and reshape it and give it to the next generation and show the power of it and the relevance of it, because it's still relevant, isn't it? It's like Solomon says in Ecclesiastes, like time goes past and the sun comes up and goes down, and it's just still the same essential principles by which mankind lives. And therefore we need to present it to them. And Rod talked about that with us, didn't he? About the relevance of that. And he talked about the traits of youth that you can use to be an ambassador for Christ. He said, you're young, you're energetic, and you're passionate. And you need to use that passion and energy to actually get the message out. I listened recently, my son Ethan told me about a podcast that I think Ben Brumby put together, right? And I listened to that podcast. It was hilarious. It was him and Jack Palmer, I think. It wasn't spiritual. He's talking about belly button fluff, right? But it showed me his ability and talent to get messages out and to explain in stories things that are relevant for young people. And that's what you need to use, those talents that God has given you to take God's message to the next generation. And all of us have got the ability to do that. Now, the next trait that Timothy had was he was timid and he was shy. And maybe that's you in your life. And you think that perhaps I haven't got the ability to be able to share what I know. But God saw great value in humility and timidness and being shy. And it's not that God wanted Timothy to be fearful in this state, but he recognized that there was something about that characteristic that would be essential for his growth. If you just want to look at 1 Timothy chapter 1, and we'll just read verse 7 to 8, where he says this: For God has not given us the spirit of fear. And perhaps Timothy naturally felt a little bit this way. But he's given us the spirit of power and of love and of a sound mind. Be not therefore ashamed of the testimony of the Lord, nor of me his prisoner, but be thou a partaker of the afflictions of the gospel according to the power of God, who has saved us and called us with an holy calling, not according to our works, but according to his own purpose and grace, which was given in Christ Jesus before the world began. And what Paul is trying to drive to this man, Timothy, is that the power that he can unlock in his life and the power by which all of the gospel message in our own life will have power is the message itself. And we've been learning about that this weekend, that it's God's message and it was God's salvation. And Brother Steve talked about that this morning in the power of the atonement. And it's our response to that beautiful message and beautiful saving forgiveness that is the motivating power that can drive our life. And Paul wanted to share this with Timothy because he was a man that naturally might have thought that he didn't have the ability to do so. But Paul says it's not your power. It's the power that comes from God and from his word. And if we harness that, then we can do anything in our service to God. Anything we can do, God will work with us. Paul in 2 Corinthians 4, a chapter before chapter 5, which we were taking our theme for the weekend on, Paul likens our life to clay vessels. And that's what we're like. We're like these clay crumbling vessels that ultimately in ourselves are weak with no power, but we have within ourselves, this amazing message of the gospel, which is able to transform and give power to our life. And so Paul says, you need to stir up the gift that's in you. And that word stir means to rekindle. So it's like when you're making a fire. When you're making a fire, I'm pretty pathetic because I put about 14 of those firelighters in there to get it going. And then when that doesn't work, Ethan usually gets a deodorant can and sprays it with a match to get it going. But if you are genuine in how they used to make fires back in the day, is you've got to craft it carefully, don't you? And you have to rekindle that fire. And if you put the right things in there, that fire will begin to grow, and you put more little kindling on it until it grows into a roaring fire. And Paul says, that's the way you need to ignite this power in your own life. And we've seen this weekend through our brother Darren that one of the tools by which we can use that God designed for that rekindling process to happen is, of course, the study of his word. And the way that Brother Darren looked at all of the techniques and the study that we can do in our daily life was really important. And some of those techniques we've really got to hang on to. And one of the things I think for me is really important is just over in 2 Timothy chapter 3, words that are very familiar to us. But when he's talking about the scriptures to this man and the importance of it in his life, he says this to him in verse 14. He says, but continue in the things which you have learned and hast been assured of, knowing of whom thou hast learned them, and that from a child thou hast known the holy scriptures, which are able to make thee wise unto salvation through faith which is in Jesus Christ. What Paul highlights to Timothy here is the need for continuance in your study and application and reading of the Bible. It's not something that can be just done as a one-off burst. And I like to always think about it from the viewpoint of Elijah and Elisha. When God drove home to Elijah, the principle of how God works in your life. And I find it that I'm very forgetful about this process because the way I want to achieve things in life and even in my spiritual life is I want to do it by the fire and the wind and the earthquake. And we can fall into that trap of doing that, of going even to a weekend like this and igniting our faith and then, or going to a study week or some kind of Bible school, which are all, of course, awesomely helpful. But the way ultimately God changes lives is through the process of the still small voice, the everyday, regular, small input of God into our lives. And it's that small, regular input over a long period of time that does far more for the development of our character than any earthquake or wind or fire could ever do. That's the way God works with us. And so we need to apply ourselves to some kind of study. That's what Brother Darren said to us. He said, one thing that you should take from my session is have some kind of objective by which you will work towards. Some study in the Bible. My dad, he told me of what he did years ago. He said, for a long time, I'd sort of studied bits of the Bible and I find it hard to get motivated. And so he decided that what he was going to do, and he did it probably in about his mid-30s. He said, I'm just going to start reading the Bible a chapter a day and trying to get something out of it and just do a little bit of a study on it. If I get it to a chapter I find more interesting, I might stay at that particular chapter for a longer period of time, but I'm just going to keep going through it. And he said one of the brilliant things that did for him is it gave him somewhere to always come back to. And it didn't matter how long he took. It didn't matter how short or brief he might have looked at some particular chapters. He always had something to go back to. And you know what? 40 years later, or 35 years later, my dad's actually finished the entire Bible. And it took him that long because he did it very slowly. And he would be the first to admit that it wasn't done in any great detail, but it was something that he was able to keep going back to. And I think that's a really valuable piece of advice, to choose something, or to choose a number of collection of things that you can always go back to looking at, so that you're always got something that you're working through in your study. Because that can sometimes be the hardest thing to do. Just, I can't choose something, or I do a character study and I do like immense study on the first 2 verses of Ruth, and then I just think, I can't be bothered anymore. This is just ridiculous, and I'll leave it all. But if you can choose something that you keep going back to, don't put pressure on yourself to have to achieve anything great with it, then that's ultimately what you need to do. Now, that is going to take some effort, isn't it? And Paul to Timothy in 1 Timothy said, you've got to throw yourself wholly into these things. Be absorbed by it. So you're not going to achieve that by not making choices. And that's what Des talked about in his first session on Friday night. He talked about choices. And ultimately, we all have choices. And in a weekend like this, now is the time for choices. The choices that you can make. Des said you can't serve God and you can't serve the world. Ultimately, you need to make a choice about what you're going to do, about what your priorities are, about what you're going to use your time for. And that's, of course, something that's been difficult for every generation. But perhaps for our generation, it's maybe even more difficult than ever, only that we've got so much choice of what we could do with our time, of where we could go and what we could do. And so I urge you to make some key choices now about some long-term, sustainable Bible study goals. And these Bible study goals too, I think this is really important to understand, is that when you're doing this personal Bible study, it's primarily for yourself. And whilst you might be able to use the motivation of doing a talk for something, and I think that's awesome, and I'd put my hand up, and I'd urge all of you to any opportunity that comes, put your hand up, because it forces you to do it. Because if you're like me, you're so lazy, you would never get anything else done. But the primary objective ultimately with Bible study is to transform your own heart and mind. And that's what will happen. And then you can provide benefit and be an ambassador to others. But God has used you to transform the way that you live. Now, once you've done that, of course, Bible study needs to be something that is not just theory. It needs to be put into practice. And if it's just theory, then it's a complete waste of time. It needs to be put into our everyday life. And so Paul said to Timothy, didn't he? As Brother Rod said, he says, we need to exercise ourselves in godliness. Take some of these principles that we actually learn and start to put them into practice in our everyday life, in the way that we live. Now, that will be hard and it will be imperfect, but that's the point. That's why Paul says, exercise yourself. When you go and exercise to do any kind of physical activity or to work towards a particular goal, there will be failure in that process. But failure is the purpose of it, because that's where you learn. And so we need to put into practice our faith in the everyday. One of the things I find, and we can get all very distraught about our sins and our failure in our life, because we set ourselves to do something and we don't do it again. And then we set ourselves to do something again and we don't do it again. But one of the beautiful things about that in the truth is when we do fail, it makes us appreciate two things. It makes us appreciate, one, how amazing Jesus Christ was in his life. How unbelievable he was in the life that he set himself to commit to. And the other thing that it does for us is it makes us appreciate the forgiveness of our Father and our need ultimately to rely on him. And that's the process God is trying to bring to us in our life. He's trying to bring us to absolute reliance on him and him alone. And this process of failure can sometimes be the greatest assistance for that, because we realize that ultimately we are in need of him. So training is important. Putting these things into practice is essential for what we're going to do from here. Now, Timothy did this, right? He was a man that backed up his life in accordance to what he said. And that's what made him so powerful. Just go back to 1 Timothy chapter 1. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5. This is the characteristic that Paul takes from the life of Timothy, which he realizes is of such great value. He says, when I call to remembrance the unfeigned faith that is in you, and which dwelt first in your grandma Lois and your mother Eunice, I am persuaded that it is in you also. So the quality that made Timothy shine was this quality of unfeigned faith. Now, you've probably got in your margin. If you haven't, you should write it in there. That word unfeigned means unhypocritical faith. It's a genuine faith. I like the word authentic. An authentic faith. That's what we're ultimately all striving for. And those themes have come out time and time again this weekend. We are trying to achieve an authenticity in our faith, a genuineness about how our life looks in reflection to what we say. And this man, Timothy, was exactly like that. And you notice in that verse where he got it from. It was passed down from his mother and from his grandmother before. Now, sometimes we think that ultimately only a genuine faith or a premium type of faith that God is looking for is one that is someone that's done some amazing thing or achieved some great feat or come from a remarkable place and they've discovered this enormous, amazing faith. But you know what? Genuine faith can be passed on from your mother or your grandmother or your father or your grandfather, and you can make it yours. And most of us are in that circumstance. We've been passed this faith from our families or from some relative who's given us this faith. We need to own that for ourselves and make it genuine and make it sincere. And that's what Timothy was able to do. And you know what? There was some people in his ecclesial circle that had gone down a different path. Just look over at 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 5. It says there that there were some that hadn't generated their understanding of the scriptures into a genuine faith. And they were found in verse 5 when it says they had a form of godliness, but denied the power thereof. From these people, Paul says, turn away. Now that word form, does anyone know what that word is? Just to shock you with a bit of class participation in the Greek.
Turn away from God.
What's that?
Turn away from God.
No, I'm after the Greek word. What's the Greek word form?
Morphosis.
I don't know.
Morphosis, right? Is that Luke Dodson? And you cheated. You just got it from me, Sword. It's morphos. Yeah, that's right. Morphosis, right? And it's like the second half of the word, metamorphosis. And you remember that Paul used that word metamorphosis in Romans chapter 12, when he talked about what we all need to be doing to generate a real, authentic faith, and that is a transformation of who we are. But Paul said there's some people like these people who have a form of godliness, and they haven't got to the stage of transforming their life to actually reflect what they believe. And Paul says you got to be very careful of that. We need people who are authentic in their beliefs. And that's what Shane talked about, didn't he, in his talk when he talked about the Lord Jesus Christ. And ultimately, the conclusion of his study, he came down to where ultimately all of this needs to affect us. And that is in our hearts. Your personal heart and my personal heart. That is where God is ultimately looking for the change. And that's where the power is. And see, that's the problem with those people in verse 5 who had taken the theoretical parts of this and applied it to their lives, but never actually made a physical change. Paul says they're missing out on the ultimate power that can be used to change people's lives. And that power is our transformed lives. That's what the power of our ambassadorship is. Sometimes we think that the way that we'll get people into the meeting or by preaching is by doing some amazing lecture that's just going to suddenly blow someone's socks off at the right particular time in their life, and they'll radically change who they are. But if you think about who you know who's come into the meeting, and I can think of the people that I know, and it's usually not that many that have come from outside, but the ones who have, almost 100% have come through being influenced by someone's life in the way they actually lived in an authentic way. And that's how the power of the gospel works. It works in our lives. You think of the man Joseph, who just went about his business from day to day in an authentic and real, unfeigned faith. And everyone he came into contact with was affected by him, recognized that there was something different about him, and there was a power to his life. And all of the Bible characters are the same, aren't they? Ultimately, it's their life, who they become, which becomes the power. And that's the way God is going to use us to appeal to people through us. It's not necessarily going to be through our words, although it might be sometimes. The real power in which God will use us to be ambassadors is he will use our transformed lives to show people that there is a better way and that there is a better future for this world. And that's where our preaching can be most effective. And you know what? Right now in the world, you've probably noticed it, and I certainly have. But right now, there's like an open little door of opportunity to preach to people's hearts. Because people's hearts are open, maybe not fully, but open just a little bit more than what they were a couple of months ago. Because people have had their lives rattled. And some of the sureties and firm foundations that they thought were so sure in their life have become crumbly. And they're looking for authentic faith, for people who have got an idea of where they're going in life. And that's where our lives can help to transform people. That's where we can be powerful ambassadors for Christ if we represent that to them. Now, what did that look like in the life of this man, Timothy? Just come quickly to Philippians chapter 2, a passage that Brother Sam looked at yesterday in his beautiful exhortation that he gave to us all. Philippians chapter 2. What did this man, Timothy, look like in his everyday life? What does an ambassador for Jesus Christ look like? Sometimes we might think that the ultimate ambassador for Christ would be brash. He would be arrogant. He would be abrasive. He'd be out the front there just preaching an unbelievably powerful message for everyone just to be rocked in their seats by. But look at verse 20 to 22 of Philippians chapter 2. For I have no man like-minded who will naturally care for your state. For all seek their own, and not the things which are Jesus Christ's. But you know the proof of him, that as a son with a father, he has served me in the gospel. That was the ambassador that he chose. A man like this man, Timothy. A man that put priority on the needs of other people. And that's what Sam was talking about yesterday, his exhortation, wasn't he? Ultimately, a pure and authentic faith will be one that leads to humility, a change of mind. Just like earlier in those verses in Philippians talked about the mind of Jesus Christ, that ultimately was the mind of a servant. And that's what this man Timothy was like. The ambassador that we want to be is like him. A man that ultimately, if you all boil it down, cared for other people above the cares of himself. And that's what this young man was like. He put priority on the needs of others. And it had become natural to him. He naturally cared and loved his brothers. That's what ambassadorship is. And that's what we need to cultivate in our own life, this ability to care. And I think that comes out in two ways, or probably more, but two ways that we can highlight. One is this. It comes out in a genuine love and care for our brotherhood. We've been blessed to be given this amazing fellowship that we share. And our brotherhood is something that I think is amazing, and we need to love and have genuine care for. And sometimes we can talk a little bit down about it because of the imperfections in it. But it is imperfect. And that's the whole point. It will be always imperfect until the bride is united with the groom in the kingdom of God. We have an imperfect ecclesia, but we should care for it, and we should love it, and we should appreciate it. And I don't know about you, but for me, over the last couple of months, since this whole thing's happened in our world, I've come to appreciate things about my meeting which I would never have appreciated before, or perhaps didn't care or think about enough. We have a network, a community, which our God has designed and given to us as brothers and sisters and young people, other people that we can reach out to. And it's a beautiful thing, and we should care for it, and we should love it and value it, even in its imperfection. And Timothy did that. He loved the brotherhood. Peter in 1 Peter says, you need to love the brotherhood and have genuine care for it. And how did that then work itself out in the way Timothy's demeanor was to preach and teach to other people? We'll just quickly come to 2 Timothy chapter 2. Second Timothy chapter 2, verse 24 to 25 says this. And the servant of the Lord, So this is us. This is ambassadors. This is what we need to be like. We're servants. And that's what Des said on Friday night, didn't he? He said we're called to be servants. The servant of the Lord must not strive, but be gentle unto all men, apt to teach, patient, in meekness, instructing those that oppose themselves, if God peradventure will give them repentance to the acknowledging of truth. That's what the ambassador looks like in his care for individuals in the meeting. He's not contentious. He's not looking for a fight. He's not militant. He's gentle. But he's apt to teach. He's put time into knowing what he believes and sorting out what is truth and recognizing how important those principles can be for his own life and how powerful they can be to others. And then when he goes to transfer that to other people, he does it in a gentle way, in meekness. And that is very, very powerful. If you can cultivate that in the way that you are ambassadors for Christ. And you know what? That will achieve far more than any other way. I have found in the experiences of my life that the way that you can help people and bring about change is always through a slow process of care and involving yourselves in people's lives. That can be difficult because it's a commitment that takes a long time. And we want sometimes to get results quickly. We get frustrated with maybe a small group that we've got, or that we're not making enough progress, or we want to do something quick that's going to just ignite things and change things in a very quick way. But this is the way that the ambassador of Christ works. He works in gentleness. He works in meekness. He works in care. And that's what we need to do in our ecclesias, in our young people circles. We need to find people, and there's always people, there's heaps of people who need your care, who you can adopt, and you can teach, and you can share what you know with them and become ambassadors for Christ. And that is the kind of thing that can have the greatest impact. And that's why Paul chose this man, Timothy. And then finally, the final thing that I think is important for us to concentrate on as far as ambassadors are concerned is that Paul said ambassadors with an S. He said it in the plural because he knew that he needed a multitude of people to be his ambassadors. He couldn't never have just one. And he knew in his own life that he needed a connected group of people who were all working to the same purpose and the same goal to get things done. You know, I didn't know this before, but I looked into, I thought, I wonder how many people there were which Paul worked with his own life. You think about, Silas, sort of Barnabas, John Mark, who he got a bit upset with, right? And you sort of think, maybe there was about 10 people that he sort of was working with that are mentioned in the New Testament. I looked at it. There's over 100 people that he mentions by name who were working with him, who he greets in his letters, who he tells about, or he highlights that they're doing a particular thing, or he's given a particular function to this person, or this person's become a messenger. People like that I've never heard of, right? People like Quartus and Seconus and Tertius and Zenos and Andronicus and Junia and Apletus and Apelles and Ephanitus and Aristarchus and Agrippus and Damaris and Erastus and Jason and Rufus and his mother and Starchius and Urbanus. And I could go on reading of hundreds of these people that Paul worked with. And they all became important ambassadors to present Christ to the world in the way that they were living. And God needs that today. And his son needs that today. He needs a multitude of ambassadors to take on that role of showing him to the world around us. And he's called you and he's called me to be those ambassadors to him. And we need to be connected in that. And perhaps I think on reflection over the last couple of years, maybe 5 years, I think we're probably more connected in the technology that we've got than we've ever been before. But perhaps in all that connecting, we're perhaps less connected than what we have been. And I think one of the things that's come out of this whole process over the last couple of months is the ability to do something like this, and the ability to feel connected with all these brothers all over Australia and all over the world who feel the same passion for what they want to achieve in life. And if there's one thing that we can get out of it, I think we should continue to do that in some form, in some way. Because Paul knew that to stay connected can help us to keep focused. So I would urge us to try and do that. And maybe there's some other things that we can organise to collectively like this from time to time, which refocus us in our walk towards him. But in the meantime, the baton is held out to you. Paul and Jesus Christ and our Father have passed on that baton to you, and they've put it in your hand. But you've got to put your hand out and take it. And that's what you're going to do now after this weekend. You've got to take some of these things that we've all learned, and you've got to apply it in the way that you live and in the way that you interact and the care that you have for your brothers and sisters. So